My name is Claire Whitfield, and I am 36 years old. 9 years ago, my mother told me I was dead to her. 2 weeks ago, she stood on my front porch in the rain, holding a folder of unpaid medical bills, asking me to save her life. I want to tell you what happened in between, because the space between those two moments is where I became a different person entirely. I grew up in Cedar Falls, a small town in eastern Iowa where the tallest building was the grain elevator and the biggest news of any given month was who got confirmed at First Lutheran or whose corn came in early. My father, Robert Whitfield, managed the John Deere dealership on Route 9 for 26 years. My mother, Susan, taught 3rd grade at Cedar Falls Elementary and ran the church bake sale with the discipline of a woman commanding an army. We were not wealthy, but we were respectable, and in Cedar Falls, respectable was its own kind of currency. I was the older of 2 daughters. My sister, Bate, was 2 years younger, blonde where I was brown-haired, effortless where I was careful, the daughter who never had to try. I was the one who got straight A's, who never missed curfew, who did everything right and somehow still felt like I was one mistake away from disappointing everyone. I didn't resent Bate for it. I resented the quiet math of our house, the way affection seemed rationed, and Bates' cup always seemed to run a little fuller than mine. I left for the University of Iowa when I was 18, the first person in my family to go away to college instead of the community college 40 minutes from home. My mother cried when she dropped me off, and for a moment I thought it was because she'd miss me. Later I understood it was because Iowa City felt to her like the edge of the known world, and she was afraid of what might happen to me out there, away from Cedar Falls, away from people who looked like us and prayed like us and voted like us. She had no idea how right she was to be afraid, though not for the reasons she thought. I met Darius Coleman in my sophomore year in a shared economics seminar that neither of us particularly wanted to be in. He sat by the window because he said the radiator by the door made him sleepy, and he raised his hand more than anyone else in the room, not because he wanted attention, but because he actually cared about getting the answer right. He was from Chicago, the South Side, the oldest of 3 boys raised by his mother Yvonne after his father passed when Darius was 9. Yvonne worked as a nurse at Cook County for 31 years. She used to tell people she raised 3 men on double shifts and prayer, and she wasn't exaggerating about either one. Darius was tall, quiet in the way that made you lean in rather than look away, and funny in a dry, unhurried way that snuck up on you. He wanted to be an actuary, which he said with a straight face like it was the most romantic ambition in the world, and somehow, by the 3rd time he said it, I believed him. Our first date was coffee that turned into 4 hours at a diner on Dubuque Street, the kind of place with sticky menus and bottomless refills. He paid, then insisted I pay for dessert so it would feel even, which made me laugh so hard I nearly choked on a milkshake. We dated quietly for 2 years before either of us used the word love out loud. Both of us cautious in our own ways, both of us aware, without ever saying it directly, that where we came from would have opinions about where we were going. I brought him home for the first time at Christmas of my junior year. I remember the drive back to Cedar Falls, how I rehearsed the introduction in my head for 3 hours, how Darius kept his hand steady on the gear shift and told me it would be fine, that people surprised you sometimes. I wanted so badly to believe him. My father shook his hand at the door, a firm, brief grip, and said, "Nice to meet you," in a voice that gave away nothing. My mother smiled with her mouth but not her eyes, the kind of smile you give a stranger who has knocked on your door selling something you don't want. Dinner was chicken and dumplings, and the conversation moved in careful circles around Darius entirely, as if he were a piece of furniture that had been moved into the room without anyone's permission. Bate asked him 2 polite questions about Chicago, and then spent the rest of the meal talking about her boyfriend, Tyler, who worked construction and had gone to Cedar Falls High 2 years behind me. After Darius went to bed in the guest room, I heard my parents' voices through the thin wall of the hallway, my mother's voice low and urgent. "Robert, you have to say something to her." My father's voice tired. "Say what, Susan? She's 20 years old. She's going to do what she's going to do." I lay awake that night with my hand pressed flat against my chest, willing my heart to slow down, telling myself it was nerves, that families needed time, that this was just the initial shock of something unfamiliar. I told myself a lot of things that Christmas that turned out not to be true. Darius proposed 2 years later, the summer after graduation, in the botanical garden in Chicago where his mother used to take him and his brothers when they were small and she couldn't afford anything else. He didn't get on one knee with a big speech. He just took my hand near the rose garden and said, "I've been doing the math on this for a while now, Claire, and I keep landing on the same answer. I want you for all of it. Will you marry me?" I called my mother that same night, sitting on the edge of Darius's bed with the ring still unfamiliar on my finger, my voice shaking with a happiness I hadn't let myself feel yet, wanting so badly to share it with the woman who raised me. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I counted it the way you count the seconds between lightning and thunder to measure how close the storm really is. 8 seconds. Mom, I heard you, she said. Her voice was flat, careful, like she was reading from a script she'd prepared in advance in case this call ever came. I need you to think very carefully about what you're doing, Claire. This isn't just about you. This is about this whole family and what people are going to say and what kind of life you're choosing for yourself. I'm choosing Darius, I said. That's it, that's the whole choice. It's never that simple, she said. You'll understand that someday. My father got on the extension. He didn't say congratulations. He cleared his throat and said, your mother's had a long day, Claire, we'll talk about this. We did talk about it eventually 3 weeks later over a phone call that I will remember for the rest of my life in fragments, the way you remember a car accident. My mother told me that if I married Darius, I should not expect her and my father to attend. She told me that she had prayed on it, that she had spoken to Pastor Mayer about it, that she loved me but could not, in good conscience, stand up in a church and bless a marriage she believed was a mistake I would regret for the rest of my life. She used the word mistake 3 times. She never once said his name. I got off the phone and sat on the bathroom floor of our apartment for 40 minutes before Darius found me. He didn't say anything. He just sat down next to me on the cold tile and put his arm around my shoulders and let me cry until I ran out of tears. And then he made us grilled cheese sandwiches at 11 at night because it was the only thing either of us knew how to cook well. And we ate them sitting on the kitchen counter like teenagers. And somewhere in that ridiculous, ordinary moment, I decided that whatever my mother thought she was protecting by staying away, it wasn't going to be me. We got married on a Saturday in October at a small chapel outside Chicago, the kind with folding chairs and stained glass held together with more determination than budget. 32 guests, all from Darius's side except for my college roommate Priya, who flew in from Denver and cried through the entire ceremony, and my father's sister, my Aunt Carol, who came without telling my mother, sat in the back row and slipped me $200 in an envelope with a note that said, I'm sorry, it's just me. I love you both. Yvonne wore a lavender dress and cried before I even walked down the aisle. She hugged me so tight after the ceremony that I felt, for the first time since the engagement, like I actually had a mother in the room. My parents did not come. My mother sent a card 2 weeks later, the only piece of mail I received from Cedar Falls that entire year. Inside, on lined notebook paper, she had written 4 sentences. I have kept that piece of paper for 9 years, and I can still recite it from memory. Claire, I hope you understand this is not personal. I hope someday you'll see I was trying to protect you. Your father and I will always love you, but we cannot support this decision. Please don't call for a while. Please don't call for a while turned into please don't call for 9 years, though nobody ever said it that plainly. It just happened in silence, the way a wound closes over if you leave it alone long enough, leaving scar tissue where skin used to be. The first year of marriage was lean. Darius was studying for his actuarial exams while working nights at an insurance call center, and I was substitute teaching by day and waiting tables at a diner on Halsted Street 3 nights a week. We lived in a 600-square-foot apartment above a laundromat, and the smell of dryer sheets seeped into everything we owned, our couch, our towels, our winter coats. I didn't mind it. There was something almost funny about it. The 2 of us eating ramen at a card table we'd bought for $8 at a church rummage sale, plotting out a life neither set of parents had blessed. I called my mother 4 times that first year. Every single time it went to voicemail, her recorded voice cheerful and unchanged, promising to call back as soon as she could. She never called back. I left messages anyway, short and careful, the kind where you choose every word because you suspect it might be the last one anyone in that house ever hears. Hi Mom, it's Claire. Just wanted to say hi and let you know we're doing okay. I miss you, call whenever you're ready. She was never ready. My sister Bate was more honest than my parents in her own way. She texted me sporadically that first year, never about anything important, just fragments of a life continuing without me. Tyler proposed. She was pregnant. She and Tyler bought a house 2 streets over from our parents. Once, drunk texting after a bachelorette party, she wrote, "For what it's worth, I think Mom is being ridiculous, but you know how she gets when she's decided something." I wrote back, "Thank you for saying that." She never brought it up again, sober or otherwise. I found out my parents had a grandson, Bates' son Caleb, from a Facebook photo 11 months after he was born. My mother had posted it with the caption, "Our whole world." A photo of Caleb propped on my father's knee in the same recliner I'd been rocked to sleep in as a baby. I sat with that photo open on my phone for a long time, in the break room of the elementary school where I was substitute teaching, and I felt something in me go quiet and cold in a way it hadn't before. Not angry exactly. Something more permanent than anger, a kind of understanding settling into my bones. This is simply how it is going to be now. Darius passed his first actuarial exam that spring, then his second the following fall. He landed a junior analyst position at a mid-sized insurance firm downtown, and for the first time since we'd married, we could afford to move somewhere the walls didn't smell like fabric softener. I finished my teaching certification and took a permanent position at a public elementary school on the north side, 3rd grade, the same grade my mother had taught for 26 years in a town 8 hours away that no longer answered my calls. There is a particular kind of grief in doing the thing your mother did, teaching the exact grade she taught, standing in front of 8-year-olds explaining long division the way she once explained it to me, and having no one from your childhood to call and tell about it. I used to stand at the whiteboard some afternoons after the kids went home and think about calling her, just to say, "Mom, guess what I teach?" And then I would remember that guess what never worked on a person who had already decided not to guess anything about my life at all. Caleb turned 2 the year I got pregnant with our first child. I sent my mother the ultrasound photo anyway, some stubborn, hopeful part of me still testing the door to see if it had really locked as tightly as I thought. The envelope came back 3 weeks later, stamped in red ink, returned to sender. I sat at our kitchen table and stared at that stamp for a long time, and then, without quite deciding to, I got a manila folder from the hallway closet and put the envelope inside it, unopened, the way you preserve evidence rather than a memory. I didn't know yet that folder would become something much bigger. Our daughter Maya was born on a snowy morning in February, 7 pounds 2 ounces, with a full head of dark curly hair that made the delivery nurse laugh out loud. Darius cried holding her, the same way he says his own father never got the chance to do. And I remember thinking, watching him, that whatever my mother believed she'd been protecting me from, this was not it. This, holding this astonishing, furious, red-faced little person was the opposite of a mistake. Yvonne flew in from Chicago, which at that point was only a 90-minute drive since we'd relocated near Darius's new job, and she stayed for 10 days. She cooked greens and cornbread and rocked Maya at 3 in the morning so I could sleep. And on the 5th night, exhausted and raw in that particular postpartum way where every emotion sits right under the skin, I told her I was sorry her granddaughter would never know my side of the family. Yvonne set down the dish towel she was holding, looked at me with the calm, unshakable patience of a woman who had buried a husband and raised 3 sons alone, and said, "Baby, that little girl has more grandmother in this house than most children get in 2 houses. Don't you apologize to me for anybody else's foolishness." I sent my mother a birth announcement anyway, returned. I sent a photo of Maya's first Christmas, returned. I sent an invitation to her christening. Returned, this one with the envelope visibly retaped, as if someone had opened it, looked inside, and sealed it back up before sending it away again. I never found out for certain who opened it. I had my suspicions, but suspicion isn't proof, and by then I had learned the difference mattered to me more than it used to. By the time our son, Elijah, was born 2 years later, the manila folder had become a proper accordion file, and I had started, almost without noticing I was doing it, labeling things. Dates, what was sent, what came back, it wasn't revenge. I want to be very clear about that because I know how it might sound. It was closer to what a person does when they've been told a story doesn't matter and some stubborn part of them decides to write it down anyway, just in case someday someone asks whether it happened at all. Darius made senior actuary status the year Elijah turned 3, and around that same time we made a decision that changed the shape of our whole life. Darius had always had an idea rattling around in his head, something about how independent insurance agents, especially smaller regional ones, were drowning in outdated risk modeling software built for giant firms with giant budgets. He wanted to build something leaner, faster, purpose-built for the agents everyone else had priced out of good tools. I had spent 6 years teaching 3rd grade and moonlighting doing tax prep for extra money every spring, and between the two of us, we understood risk modeling and small business finance well enough to be dangerous. We built Coleman Risk Analytics in our garage, quite literally on 2 second-hand desks and a whiteboard from Office Depot. I kept teaching for the first 18 months because we needed the health insurance and the steady paycheck, coming home every evening to review client pricing models with Darius until midnight. The two of us hunched over spreadsheets while Maya's nightlight glowed down the hall. It was exhausting in a way that felt, for the first time in my adult life, entirely mine. Nobody had handed us this. Nobody was watching to approve or disapprove. We built it in the dark on purpose, and it was ours. Coleman Risk Analytics landed its first real client, a 15-agent regional firm in Rockford 8 months after we started, and by the end of that first year we had 11 clients, and I finally quit teaching to run operations and finance full-time. I want to be honest, it wasn't glamorous. It was invoices and late nights and a business bank account that dipped dangerously low more than once, and Darius and I arguing quietly in the kitchen at midnight about whether we could afford to hire a 4th employee. But it was growing, steadily, the way a tree grows rather than the way a firework goes off, and every year the numbers looked a little less frightening and a little more possible. Meanwhile, 400 miles away, life in Cedar Falls went on without me, and I watched it the way you watch a house you used to live in from across the street. through the curtain of social media, never quite letting myself look away. Bate had a second child, a daughter named Ivy. My mother retired from teaching after 29 years with a party at the VFW hall that the local paper covered with a photo and a paragraph. My father's hair went fully gray. Every so often a mutual friend from high school would send me a screenshot of something. A Sunday dinner photo, a 4th of July barbecue, always the same 4 people and eventually 2 grandchildren smiling in front of the same house I grew up in. And every time I felt the same quiet click of a folder closing in some drawer inside my chest. Once at Bates' daughter's baptism, someone tagged me in a comment by mistake, a family friend writing, "Wish Claire could be here too," and my mother replied publicly just 3 words. That was her choice. I remember reading it standing in our garage office, Maya asleep in a bouncer chair beside my desk, and thinking with a clarity that almost felt like relief that my mother had never once in all those years referred to Darius by name in anything I'd seen. Not once, he was always this, or that decision, or her choice. As if naming him might make him more real than she could tolerate, I stopped waiting for her to change her mind somewhere around year 5. Not out of bitterness, but out of a kind of practical acceptance, the way you stop checking a wound that has already scarred over. I had a husband who built me a life out of nothing, twice, once as a marriage and once as a company. I had 2 children who were loved fiercely by a grandmother who showed up, who learned their birthdays and their favorite foods and the names of their stuffed animals. I had in every way that mattered a family. It simply wasn't the one I was born into. By year 7, Coleman Risk Analytics had grown to 22 employees and a real office suite in Naperville, with a conference room and a lobby with our company name in brushed steel letters on the wall. We closed a growth equity investment that spring, $6 million from a firm out of Minneapolis that specialized in backing insurance technology companies. And for the first time, Darius and I looked at each other over a signed term sheet and understood in a very concrete way that we were not going to have to worry about money for the rest of our lives, provided we didn't do anything foolish with it. A small trade publication, Insurance Tech Weekly, ran a profile on us that summer, complete with a photo of Darius and me standing in front of the office with our arms crossed, looking, I thought, faintly ridiculous like 2 people cosplaying as executives. The article mentioned Cedar Falls, Iowa as my hometown almost as an aside, a single sentence buried in the 4th paragraph. I didn't think much of it at the time. I certainly didn't think anyone back home would read a trade publication about insurance software. I was wrong about that, as it turned out, though it would take almost 2 years for the consequences to reach my front door. Maya turned 7 and Elijah turned 5 the year my father had his first heart attack. I found out from Bate 3 days after it happened in a text that read, "Just so you know, Dad had a heart thing but he's okay now, didn't want you to hear it somewhere weird." I sat with that text for a long time trying to decide what I felt. I called the hospital directly, was told politely that I wasn't listed as an authorized contact, and had to have Bate relay updates for the 4 days he was there. I sent flowers to the hospital room anyway, a modest arrangement of yellow tulips because I remembered somehow that yellow had always been his favorite color, more than my mother's favorite roses. Bate told me later that my mother had them moved to the hallway outside his room, not thrown away, not returned, just moved somewhere she wouldn't have to look at them each time she walked in. My father recovered. I never got a call from him about it, not once, not before, during, or after. I understood by then that whatever affection might have existed for me under all that silence, he had decided long ago it wasn't worth the argument it would start in his own house to express it. Somewhere in those growth years, Bate got remarried. Quietly, after her marriage to Tyler ended in a divorce I only learned about from a passing comment in one of her rare texts. I found out about the second wedding, to a man named Greg who ran an auto body shop outside Cedar Falls, from a photo posted by a cousin I was still, for whatever reason, connected to online. Small church, 40 guests, a reception in the same VFW hall where my mother's retirement party had been held. I was not invited and I had stopped expecting to be by then, but what stayed with me longer than the exclusion itself was a single detail in the background of one photo. My parents seated at the head table, my father in a tie I didn't recognize, both of them laughing at something outside the frame, looking, for all the world, like people whose lives had continued on perfectly well without the daughter missing from the picture. I remember showing the photo to Darius, not out of hurt exactly, but out of a kind of numb curiosity, the way you might point out a scar that had stopped aching so long ago you'd almost forgotten it was there. He looked at it for a long moment and said, "You know none of that is about you anymore, right? That's just them being them. It stopped being about you the day they decided silence was easier than an argument." I think that was the moment I finally fully believed him. I threw myself into the business after that in a way that had less to do with ambition, and more to do with building something so solid and so undeniably mine that no absence could shake it. We opened a second office in Milwaukee the year Maya started first grade. We hired our 50th employee the year Elijah lost his first tooth. Every milestone in my children's small lives ran parallel to a milestone in the company Darius, and I had built out of nothing but 2 second-hand desks and a stubborn refusal to ask anyone's permission. And somewhere in that parallel growing, I stopped waiting for Cedar Falls to notice it all. That was the last real news I had from Cedar Falls for almost 2 years, until the rain and the folder and my mother standing on my porch. I need to back up, though, because before that porch, before the folder of medical bills, there was a phone call I received about 6 weeks earlier that I understand now was the true beginning of the end of this particular silence. It came from a woman named Darlene Petrie, a name I recognized instantly because Darlene had been my mother's closest friend since before I was born, the kind of friendship built on 40 years of shared casseroles and church committees. I hadn't spoken to Darlene since my wedding, or rather since my non-wedding, since she was one of the people who very publicly declined my invitation with a card that read only, "Praying for you, sweetheart," which even at 24 I understood to be a kind of polite condemnation. "Claire, honey," she said when I picked up, her voice carrying the particular warmth of someone about to ask you for something. "I hope it's all right that I got your number from Bait. I wanted to talk to you about your mother." My stomach dropped in the specific way it does when you sense, before anyone says a word, that the ground beneath a long-standing arrangement is about to shift. "Is she okay?" "Well," Darlene said, drawing the word out slowly, "she's not sick, not exactly. But Claire, your parents are in some trouble, and I don't think your mother would ever tell you herself, so I'm going to because somebody ought to, and Bates got her hands full with the kids and Tyler's job situation." What Darlene told me over the next 20 minutes was this. My father's heart attack 2 years earlier had been the first of two, the second one 6 months prior, worse than the first, requiring a procedure that insurance only partially covered. My father had also, in the years since retiring from the dealership, made a series of what Darlene delicately called unwise investments, with a financial advisor at their church who turned out to be running something closer to a Ponzi scheme than an actual advisory practice. Between the medical bills and the lost retirement savings, my parents were, in Darlene's words, sitting on close to $100,000 in debt they have no earthly way of paying. And your mother has too much pride to ask anybody in this town because everybody already knows everybody's business here and she cannot stand the shame of it. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, though some cold, clear part of me already knew. "Because," Darlene said, "I know for a fact your mother has seen that article about your company. Somebody printed it out and brought it to Bible study, if you can believe that. And I think, Claire, whether she'll ever say it to your face or not, she is going to come to you. I wanted you to hear it from me first so it doesn't catch you off guard." I didn't sleep much that night or many nights after. I told Darius everything Darlene had said, sitting at our kitchen island long after the kids were in bed, and he listened the way he always listens, without interrupting, his hand resting flat on the counter like he was steadying something invisible. "How do you feel about it?" he finally asked. "I don't know," I said, and it was the truest thing I'd said in a while. Some part of me feels sick that they're struggling. And some part of me feels like I've spent 9 years learning not to need anything from that house, and now the very first time they need something from me, it's money. Darius nodded slowly. "Whatever you decide will be fine either way. That's not what worries me. What worries me is you making a decision out of guilt instead of out of what you actually want." I thought about that for 6 weeks, turning it over the way you turn over a stone looking for what's underneath. I didn't call Cedar Falls. I didn't reach out to Darlene again. I simply waited the way I imagine a person waits for whether they've been warned is coming, and on a Tuesday afternoon in April, with rain coming down in the kind of steady gray sheet that Chicago suburbs specialize in every spring, the doorbell rang. I knew before I opened the door. I don't know how exactly, except that some part of me had been braced for this exact moment for 6 weeks, maybe for 9 years. My mother stood on the porch in a beige raincoat I didn't recognize, her hair grayer than I remembered, a battered leather folder clutched against her chest like a shield. She looked smaller than she had in my memory, the way people always do when you finally see them again after enough time has passed that your mind has kept building them larger and more permanent than they actually are. "Claire," she said, "just my name, nothing else, the way you might say a word you'd forgotten you knew how to pronounce." "Mom." I stood in the doorway for a long moment, not stepping back to let her in, not closing the door either. Behind me I could hear Maya and Elijah in the family room, some cartoon playing too loud, the sounds of a life my mother had chosen 9 years ago not to be part of. "What are you doing here? Can I come in?" she asked. "It's raining." I let her in. I want to be honest about why, not out of forgiveness, not yet, but because some old, stubborn piece of me, the third-grade teacher's daughter who had been raised to have manners even toward people who didn't deserve them, could not stand on principle and leave a 64-year-old woman standing in the rain. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Darius and I had built spreadsheets by lamplight for 2 years, and she looked around at my kitchen, the granite counters, the professional range, the photos of Maya and Elijah on the refrigerator. with an expression I couldn't quite read. Grief maybe, or something closer to arithmetic, the specific look of a person calculating what a life might be worth. "You've done well," she said finally. "We have," I said. I did not offer her coffee. I did not sit down across from her right away. I stood at the counter with my arms crossed, the way you might stand across from someone whose intentions you haven't yet trusted enough to relax around. She opened the folder. Inside were bills, dozens of them, medical statements with red stamped totals, a letter from a collections agency, a printed bank statement with a balance so far into the negative it looked almost like a typo. She spread them across my table the way she used to spread out the church bulletin committee's budget every autumn, methodical, organized. A woman who dealt in facts even when the facts were devastating. "Your father needs a second procedure," she said, her voice steady in a way I recognized as the specific steadiness of someone who has rehearsed a sentence many times so it won't crack when she finally says it out loud. "The insurance won't cover it, not fully. And there was a man at church, an advisor who, well, it doesn't matter now what he did, except that he took almost everything we had. We are $94,000 in debt, Claire. Your father can't work. I'm 64 years old and no one is hiring a retired school teacher. I came here because I don't know what else to do." I looked at the papers on my table for a long time. Then I said the thing I had been turning over in my head for 6 weeks, the thing that had kept me up more nights than I wanted to admit. 9 years, Mom. 9 years, and the first time you stood in a room with me since my wedding is to ask for $94,000. Her chin lifted, that old familiar posture I remembered from every difficult conversation of my childhood, the posture of a woman who did not believe in apologizing even when she knew, somewhere underneath the posture, that she should. "I'm not proud of it," she said. "I know how this looks." "Do you?" I asked. "Because I'm not sure you do. I sent you an ultrasound photo of my daughter and you returned it unopened. I sent you a wedding photo and you sent it back stamped in red ink like I was a stranger trying to sell you something. My son is 5 years old, Mom. 5. He has never met his grandmother. He doesn't know your name. And now you're sitting at my kitchen table asking me to write a check because you finally read an article about how much money my husband and I have made." My mother was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the rain had picked up, drumming steadily against the window over the sink. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its rehearsed steadiness. "I know what I did," she said. "I've had 9 years to think about it. Claire, more time than you might imagine, sitting in that house with your father, watching your sister's children grow up down the street, knowing I had 2 more grandchildren I'd never met, because of a decision I made when I was scared and prideful and listening to the wrong people. I'm not going to sit here and tell you it was right. I know it wasn't right. I knew it wasn't right 5 years ago if you want the truth, but pride is a strange thing, Claire. The longer you hold onto a wrong position, the harder it gets to let go of it, because letting go means admitting how much you've already lost by holding on." It was the closest thing to an apology I had ever heard from my mother, and even so, it took me a moment to understand it as one, because it came wrapped in so much explanation that it almost sounded like something else. "I have something to show you," I said. I went to the office down the hall, the one that used to be Darius's garage workspace before we could afford real walls around it, and I came back with a box, not a binder, not a folder, an entire banker's box, because 9 years of returned mail and unanswered calls takes up more room than you'd think. I set it on the table next to her collections letters, and I opened it, and I started taking things out one at a time. The returned wedding photo, the returned ultrasound, the returned Christmas card with Maya's tiny handprint on the front, made in green paint at her preschool. The christening invitation with the tape marks where someone had opened it and resealed it. 9 years of birthday cards to a father who never once called back. My mother looked at each item as I set it down, and I watched something happen to her face that I had genuinely never seen there before, not once in 36 years. It cracked open, not dramatically, not with sobbing, but in the small, quiet way that a dam cracks before it actually gives way, a hairline fracture spreading slowly across something that had looked solid for a very long time. "I didn't know you kept all of this," she said very quietly. "I kept it because I needed somebody someday to be able to look at facts instead of a story," I said. "Not my version, not yours. Just what actually happened, written down, so nobody could ever tell my children it didn't." She picked up the christening invitation, turned it over in her hands, looked at the resealed tape along the edge. "Your father opened these," she said. "I want you to know that. He never told you because he didn't know how, but he opened every single one of them before I could return them, and then he taped them back up so I wouldn't know. I found out 3 years ago going through his desk. He's carried every photo of those children in his head for years, Claire, and he was too proud and too scared of me to ever say so out loud." I sat down across from her then, finally, the box of 9 years between us on the table like a third person in the conversation. "Why now?" I asked. "If it isn't the money, why did it take $100,000 in bills to get you on my porch? My mother looked down at her hands, folded in her lap, older hands than I remembered, spotted with age in a way that surprised me. "Because I am not brave, Claire," she said. "I never have been. I was brave enough to marry your father at 20 and raise 2 daughters in a town where everyone was watching, but I was never brave enough to admit I was wrong in front of people who might say I told you so. It took losing everything to make admitting it feel smaller than the shame of losing it. That is an ugly thing to say about yourself, but it's the truth, and you deserve the truth more than you deserve another 9 years of my pride." I did not cry. I want to be honest about that, because in the version of this story I imagined for years, the version where my mother finally showed up, I always cried. Instead, I felt something more complicated. A door creaking open on hinges that had rusted nearly shut, not swinging wide, just cracking enough to let in a little light. "I'm not going to pretend the last 9 years didn't happen," I said. "I'm not going to write you a check today and act like that erases returning a picture of my newborn daughter through the mail. But I also am not going to let my father die of a heart condition because you're too proud to ask twice." I called Darius into the kitchen. We talked with my mother for 2 more hours that afternoon, the rain never quite letting up outside, and by the end of it, we had worked out something none of us could have predicted 6 weeks earlier. Darius and I would cover the medical debt directly, paid straight to the hospital and not to my parents, so there could be no argument later about where the money went. The collections debt from the fraudulent advisor we agreed to help with over time, in installments tied to actual bills not handed over as a lump sum. And in exchange, I asked for the only thing that actually mattered to me. Not gratitude, not an apology performed for an audience. I asked that she meet her grandchildren in person and that she keep showing up not once, not as a transaction closed and filed away, but as an ongoing, uncomfortable, imperfect practice of actually being present. She agreed, and to her credit, in the 2 weeks since that rainy Tuesday, she has kept her word more consistently than I expected her to. She met Maya and Elijah for the first time 3 days later, standing awkwardly in my living room with a wrapped gift she clearly wasn't sure would be accepted. And Maya, who is 7 and generous in the uncomplicated way only children can afford to be, hugged her immediately and asked if she wanted to see her room. My mother cried in my living room, real tears, the first I had seen from her since I was a teenager, watching my daughter pull her by the hand down the hallway. My father has not come yet. Darlene tells me he's ashamed, that shame runs deeper in him than it does in my mother, and that it may take longer for him to find the courage to stand on this same porch. I am learning slowly not to need that timeline to move any faster than it moves. I spent 9 years learning to build a life without either of them in it, and I am not going to unlearn that patience overnight simply because the door has finally, partially opened. I still have the box, I haven't thrown it away, and I don't think I ever will. Not because I'm holding on to the hurt, but because it is proof, the way any good record is proof, that what happened, happened, and that whatever comes next between my mother and me will be built on the actual truth of those 9 years, not a softened, convenient version of it. My children will grow up knowing both, the silence and whatever comes after it, because I believe they deserve the whole ledger, not just the parts that make for an easier story. Darius asked me last week, lying in bed after the kids were asleep, whether I thought my mother would have come back at all if Coleman Risk Analytics had failed, if we were still eating ramen at a card table above a laundromat. I told him the truth, which is that I don't know, and that I've decided it doesn't actually matter. She came when she came, for whatever mixture of reasons brought her, pride finally losing its argument with love, or with need, or with both tangled together in a way even she might not be able to fully separate. What matters now is what she does with the door being open, and what I do with the fact that I was the one in the end who chose to open it. That is the whole story, exactly as it happened, without a single detail softened for the sake of a tidier ending. My family did not choose me for 9 years, and when they finally came back, it wasn't with an apology first. It was with a folder of bills. But somewhere underneath that folder, buried under 9 years of silence and nearly $100,000 of debt, there was finally an honest woman willing to say she had been wrong. I am learning to let that be enough to start with, even if it will never be enough to erase what came before it. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe to True Life Drama, and share your thoughts in the comments. See you in our next unforgettable story.